The twins were already under the water when Gaius realized what he had done. Their small hands, pale as moonlight, disappeared beneath the dark surface of the river, and the only sound was the rush of current over stone. No screams, no splashing, just silence, and the terrible understanding that the one person who could have saved them was gone because he had sent her away. 3 days earlier, he had called Livia weak. He had stood before the pack council, his jaw set with the arrogance of an alpha who believed his strength was enough, and he had banished the only Omega who had ever truly protected them. She hadn't argued. She hadn't begged. She had simply looked at him with those storm-gray eyes, nodded once, and walked into the forest with nothing but the clothes on her back and a burden of knowledge he was too blind to understand. Now his children were drowning and she was gone. If this story grips your heart the way it's gripping mine, subscribe right now so you never miss what happens next. And tell me the city you're watching from so I can send you a hug, because we're about to go on a journey that will break us before it heals us. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the moment when everything started to unravel, because Gaius's mistake didn't begin with the banishment. It began 6 months before, on a winter morning when frost covered the ground like scattered diamonds and Livia stood at the edge of the training grounds, watching him with an expression he had been too stubborn to interpret. She had been part of the Silver Pine pack for 3 years by then, though she had never truly been welcomed. Omegas were rare in their world, rarer still since the Great Sickness had swept through the packs 2 decades prior, and Livia was the only one in their territory. Most packs would have treasured her, protected her, understood that Omegas carried gifts that went beyond physical strength. But Gaius had inherited his father's prejudices along with his title, and his father had believed that only those who could fight, who could draw blood and break bones, had value in the pack hierarchy. Livia could not fight. Her frame was small, her movements gentle, her voice soft enough that you had to lean in to hear her speak. But she could do something else, something that Gaius had dismissed as superstition and old wives' tales. She could sense danger before it arrived. She could feel the threads of fate pulling tight around certain moments, certain people, and she could read the subtle signs that nature left like breadcrumbs for those wise enough to follow them. The elders had known this. They remembered when every pack had Omegas who served as advisors, as seers, as the ones who kept the Alpha's rage in check with wisdom and foresight. But Gaius was young, only 28 winters, and he had taken the Alpha position after his father's sudden death with something to prove. He didn't want wisdom. He wanted respect through fear. He wanted the other packs to hear the name Silverpine and think of warriors, of strength, of dominance. He did not want them to think of a small Omega woman with gentle hands and knowing eyes. That winter morning, Livia had approached him as he trained the younger wolves, drilling them in combat formations, teaching them how to move as a unit, how to strike fast and withdraw faster. She had waited at the edge of the grounds until he noticed her, and when he finally acknowledged her with an impatient gesture, she had spoken in that quiet voice that somehow carried across the cold air. The children should not go to the river today. Gaius had stopped mid-instruction, his hand still raised, his eyes narrowing. His twins, Marcus and Aurelia, had been planning to go with their caretaker to collect river stones for a game they loved to play. They were only 5 years old, bright and wild and fearless in the way that children are when they don't yet understand that the world can harm them. "Why?" Gaius had asked, though his tone suggested he didn't actually care about the answer. "The ice is thin where the current runs fastest," Livia had said. "I can feel it. The temperature dropped quickly last night, but not evenly. There are weak spots. The river has been frozen for weeks," Gaius had countered. "The ice is solid." "Not everywhere," she had insisted, and something in her eyes had been urgent, almost desperate. "Please, Gaius. Just this once, trust me." He had stared at her for a long moment, aware that every young wolf on the training ground had stopped to watch this exchange, aware that his authority was being questioned in front of those he needed to respect him. And so he had done what he thought an alpha should do. He had asserted his dominance. "The children will go to the river as planned," he had said coldly. "And you will not question my decisions in front of the pack again." Livia's face had gone carefully blank, but not before he had seen the flash of pain in her eyes. She had nodded, turned and walked away, her shoulders rigid beneath her thin cloak. That afternoon, Marcus and Aurelia had gone to the river with their caretaker, an older wolf named Kasia who had raised half the children in the pack. They had played on the bank, collecting stones and building small towers, laughing in the way that made Gaius's chest feel both full and aching whenever he heard it. Their mother had died bringing them into the world, and sometimes when he looked at them, he saw her face in theirs and felt the weight of having to be both father and alpha, protector and provider, knowing he was failing at both. They had been there for perhaps an hour when Marcus, adventurous and bold like his father, had spotted a particularly beautiful stone just out of reach at the water's edge. The caretaker had been momentarily distracted, helping Aurelia with her tower, and Marcus had taken 3 steps onto the ice before anyone noticed. The crack had sounded like breaking bone. Kasia had screamed and lunged forward, but Livia had appeared from nowhere, moving faster than anyone had ever seen her move, her small body suddenly filled with desperate strength. She had grabbed Marcus by the back of his coat and yanked him backward just as the ice gave way completely, just as the dark water surged up to claim the space where he had been standing a heartbeat before. The boy had been terrified but unharmed. Kasia had been shaken, and Livia had knelt in the snow, breathing hard, her hands trembling as she held Marcus against her chest and whispered something soothing into his hair. When Gaius had heard about it an hour later, he had not gone to thank Livia. He had not acknowledged that she had been right, that she had saved his son's life. Instead, he had felt a burning shame that he had been wrong, and shame in an alpha was a dangerous thing. Twisted, festered. It looked for someone to blame other than oneself. Over the following months, Gaius had begun to see Livia as a threat rather than an asset. Every time she offered advice, he heard criticism. Every time she expressed concern, he felt his authority being undermined. The other pack members had started to notice that Livia's warnings often came true, that when she said something felt wrong, it was wise to listen. And Gaius had watched as wolves who should have been looking to him for guidance had begun to glance at her first, seeking her subtle nod or shake of head before acting. It had driven him mad with resentment. The breaking point had come during a pack council meeting in late spring. They had been discussing a territorial dispute with a neighboring Blackwood pack, and Gaius had been advocating for an aggressive response, a show of force to remind them that Silverpine was not to be trifled with. Most of the council had agreed, their blood hot with the promise of conflict, their warrior hearts eager for confrontation. But Livia had spoken up, her voice cutting through the growls and aggressive posturing like a cool wind through smoke. "This is a trap," she had said simply. Every head had turned to her. She had been sitting in the corner where Omegas were traditionally placed during councils, present but not expected to speak unless addressed directly. Her violation of protocol had been stunning. "What did you say?" Gaius had asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Blackwood wants us to attack," Livia had continued, meeting his eyes without flinching. "They have been leaving false signs of aggression, goading us. If we strike first, the other packs will see us as the instigators, and we will lose the alliances we've spent years building." "You know nothing about pack politics," Gaius had snapped. "I know about strategy," she had replied. "And I know about reading signs. The Blackwood Alpha has been too obvious in his provocations. He wants us to attack so he can claim self-defense and rally the other packs against us." One of the elders, a grizzled warrior named Titus, had leaned forward. "How can you be certain?" "I cannot be certain," Livia had admitted. "But I can feel the shape of it. This is what Omegas do, Titus. We see patterns. We feel the currents beneath the surface. And this feels wrong." Gaius had stood then, his chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. "You feel it's wrong," he had repeated mockingly. "You feel it. And on the basis of your feelings, you would have me look weak in front of Blackwood. Have me appear afraid to defend our territory. I would have you appear wise," Livia had said quietly. "Wisdom is not weakness, Gaius." That had been the final straw. In front of the entire council, Gaius had declared that he was tired of Livia's interference, tired of her undermining his authority with her vague warnings and feminine intuition. He had called her a coward, had said that she weakened the pack with her constant caution, that she made them soft when they needed to be strong. And then he had banished her. The elders had protested. Even Titus, who rarely questioned Alpha decisions, had stood and argued that Livia served an important function, that Omegas had been valued by their ancestors for good reason. But Gaius had been beyond reason, drunk on his own authority and the need to prove that he alone was capable of leading the pack. Livia had accepted the banishment without argument. She had simply stood, bowed her head once in acknowledgement, and left the council chamber. By dawn the next morning she had been gone, walking into the forest with no destination and no pack to protect her. The pack had felt her absence immediately. It was like a limb had been severed, and they were only now realizing how much they had relied on it. Small disasters began to accumulate. A hunting party had ventured into territory where a bear had been nesting with cubs and had barely escaped with their lives. A storm had caught the pack unprepared because no one had noticed the signs that Livia would have read in the clouds and wind. 2 young wolves had eaten berries that Livia would have warned them away from, and had spent 3 days violently ill. But Gaius had dismissed each incident as coincidence, as bad luck, as anything except evidence that he had made a catastrophic mistake. And then came the day that broke him entirely. It had been a beautiful summer afternoon, warm and golden, the kind of day that made you forget that danger existed in the world. Marcus and Aurelia had been playing near the pack's main settlement, supervised by Cassia, when they had asked to go to the river. The same river where Marcus had nearly fallen through the ice, now flowing swift and cold with mountain melt. Cassia had been hesitant, but Gaius had been nearby and had overheard. Still raw from the constant reminders of Livia's absence, still determined to prove that he didn't need an Omega's guidance to keep his pack safe, he had given permission. "Let them go," he had said. "It's daylight. The river is beautiful right now. They'll be fine." Cassia had taken them, and Gaius had returned to his duties, meeting with scouts, reviewing territory markers, doing all the things an Alpha does to maintain order and security. He had been in the middle of a discussion about food stores when the scream had reached him. It had been Cassia's voice, raw with terror, and Gaius had known immediately that something was catastrophically wrong. He had shifted mid-run, his human form blurring into his wolf shape, and had covered the distance to the river in seconds that felt like hours. When he had arrived, he had seen Cassia standing waist-deep in the water, her arms reaching toward something Gaius couldn't see, her face twisted in horror. Other pack members had been arriving, drawn by her screams, and one of them, a young male named Decimus, had been about to dive in when Gaius had understood what was happening. The twins had been playing on a fallen log that stretched partially across the river. Somehow they had both slipped, and the current had pulled them under. Cassia had gone in after them but couldn't reach them, couldn't find them in the murky water churned up by the swift current. Gaius had dove in without hesitation, his powerful body slicing through the water, his wolf senses searching desperately for any sign of his children. Other wolves had joined him, and for minutes that felt like lifetimes, they had searched, dove, surfaced, searched again. It had been Decimus who found Marcus, his small body caught against river stones 20 feet downstream. And it had been Gaius himself who found Aurelia, her dress tangled in underwater branches, her face pale and still. They had pulled both children from the water and laid them on the riverbank. Neither was breathing. Their lips were blue, their small bodies limp and cold. Gaius had howled then, a sound of pure anguish that had echoed through the valley and silenced every bird, every creature, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He had pressed his hands against Marcus's chest, trying to force water from his lungs, trying to force life back into him, but he didn't know what he was doing, didn't have the knowledge or skill to save his own children. That was when someone had said the words that would haunt him forever. Livia would have known what to do. It had been Titus who spoke, his old voice cracking with grief and frustration. "She delivered half the children in this pack. She's pulled drowning victims from water before. She would have known." Gaius had looked up from his dying son, water streaming from his hair. His hands shaking violently. "She's gone," he had said, and hearing himself say it had made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "I sent her away." "Then pray to all the gods that she didn't go far," Titus had said, and had turned to the fastest runner in the pack. "Find her. Run until you collapse if you have to, but find her." The runner, a young woman named Claudia, had shifted and bolted into the forest without a word. On the riverbank, Gaius had continued trying to save his children, mimicking what he had seen others do, pressing on their chests, trying to clear their airways, but nothing was working. Both twins remained still and blue and silent. Time had lost meaning. It might have been minutes or hours that Gaius knelt there, refusing to accept what his eyes were telling him, refusing to believe that his pride and stubbornness had cost him his children. The pack had gathered around him in a silent circle, bearing witness to his grief, and he had felt their judgment like physical weight. He had done this. He had sent away the one person who could have prevented this, who would have sensed the danger, who would have known how to save them once the worst had happened. Then, like something from a dream, Livia had appeared at the edge of the trees. She had been running, her small body pushed beyond its limits, Claudia beside her. Her face had been scratched from branches, her clothes torn, her breathing ragged. But when she had seen the twins lying on the riverbank, her expression had shifted into something focused and fierce. She had dropped to her knees beside Aurelia without asking permission, her hands moving over the small body with practiced efficiency. She had tilted the child's head back, checked her mouth and throat, then pressed her ear to Aurelia's chest. "How long?" she had asked, her voice sharp. 10 minutes, someone had answered. "Maybe more." Livia's jaw had tightened, but she had nodded. Her hands had moved to Aurelia's chest, and she had begun pressing in a steady rhythm, counting under her breath. After 30 compressions, she had bent and breathed into Aurelia's mouth, filling her small lungs with air. She had repeated this pattern again and again, her face set with determination, refusing to stop even as Gaius watched with hope dying in his chest. 2 minutes passed. 3. Aurelia remained still. "It's too late," Gaius had whispered, his voice broken. "Be quiet," Livia had snapped, not looking up, her hands never stopping their rhythm. "You've done enough." The words had hit him like a physical blow, but he had deserved them. He had deserved much worse. After another minute, Aurelia had suddenly coughed. Water had spilled from her mouth, and she had gasped, her small body convulsing as life returned to it. Livia had quickly turned her on her side, supporting her as she coughed up river water, as color slowly returned to her face. Then Livia had moved to Marcus, repeating the same process, the same steady rhythm of compressions and breaths. This time it had taken longer, so long that Gaius had felt his heart breaking all over again. But Livia had not stopped, had not given up, and finally, Marcus had gasped and coughed and returned to the world of the living. Both children had been weak, barely conscious, but alive. Livia had wrapped them in cloaks that pack members offered, had checked them both thoroughly for injuries, had given quiet instructions for their care. Only then had she looked up at Gaius. The expression on her face had been terrible. Not angry, not accusatory, but simply exhausted and infinitely sad. "They'll live," she had said quietly. But they were very close to death. Another few minutes, and I wouldn't have been able to bring them back. Gaius had wanted to say something, anything, but words had failed him. What could he possibly say that would be adequate? "Thank you" felt obscene. "I'm sorry" felt meaningless. Livia had stood then, swaying slightly with exhaustion, and had turned to walk back toward the forest. "Wait," Gaius had managed to say, finding his voice at last. "Please, don't go." She had stopped but hadn't turned around. Her shoulders had been rigid, her small frame trembling. "I banished you," Gaius had continued, stumbling over the words. "I had no right. I was wrong. I was wrong about everything. Please, Livia. Please stay." "Why?" she had asked, and her voice had been so quiet he had barely heard it. "So you can resent me more. So you can feel reminded every day that you needed me and hated needing me." "No," he had said desperately. So I can learn. So I can be better. So I can be the alpha this pack needs, not the one my pride tells me to be. Livia had finally turned to face him. Her storm-gray eyes had been full of tears that she hadn't let fall. Your children nearly died today, Gaius. They nearly died because you were too stubborn to value wisdom over strength, too proud to admit that you don't have all the answers. I know, he had whispered. I know, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for it. Not to me, Livia had said. To them. To your pack. To everyone you've dismissed and diminished because they didn't fit your narrow definition of strength. She had been right, and Gaius had known it. He had built his vision of leadership on his father's model, on the idea that an alpha must be the strongest, the most dominant, the most fearsome. But his father had led the pack into isolation and stagnation, had driven away valuable members who didn't conform to his rigid hierarchy. Gaius had been so determined not to be weak that he had become brittle instead of strong, inflexible instead of powerful. Teach me, he had said, and there had been no pride in the words, only desperate sincerity. Teach me how to lead properly. Teach me how to value what I don't understand. Please, Livia. Give me one more chance. She had stared at him for a long time, and Gaius had felt the weight of the entire pack's attention on them both. This was his reckoning, played out in front of everyone he led, and he had known that whatever Livia decided would determine not just her fate but his own. Finally she had spoken. If I stay, things change. Truly change. Omegas are valued. Wisdom is honored alongside strength. And you listen when I tell you something is wrong, even if you don't understand why. Yes, Gaius had agreed immediately. Yes to all of it. And you make a formal apology to me in front of the Pack Council, Livia had continued. Not because I need your apology, but because they need to see that an alpha can admit fault. That had been harder to agree to, not because Gaius hadn't been sorry, but because admitting weakness in front of the council went against everything he had been taught. But when he looked at Marcus and Aurelia, still coughing weakly in their cocoons of cloaks, he had known that his pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. I will, he had said. Livia had nodded slowly. Then she had walked back toward the settlement, her small figure drawing the pack's attention like a lodestone, and Gaius had understood that something fundamental had shifted in that moment. She would never be just an omega to them again. She had proven herself in the most dramatic way possible, and they would follow her counsel now even if he ordered them not to. It had been humbling. It had been terrifying. And it had been exactly what needed to happen. Over the following weeks, Gaius had kept his promises. He had formally apologized to Livia in front of the Pack Council, his words halting and difficult but genuine. He had restructured the council to include advisors beyond just warriors, bringing in healers and historians and scouts whose wisdom had previously been dismissed. He had created a formal position for Livia as the Pack's oracle, acknowledging publicly that her gifts were valuable and necessary. But more than that, he had begun to listen. Really listen, not just to Livia but to all the voices in the pack he had previously ignored. He had started asking questions instead of issuing orders. He had begun to see strength in flexibility, power in adaptation. The twins had recovered fully from their near drowning, but the experience had changed them. Marcus had become more cautious, more thoughtful, always checking with adults before adventuring. Aurelia had developed an intense attachment to Livia, following her around the settlement whenever possible, absorbing lessons in herbs and healing and the subtle art of reading the world's hidden signs. Gaius had watched his children grow under Livia's gentle guidance, and he had felt something complex taking root in his chest. Gratitude, certainly. Respect, absolutely. But also something deeper. Something that made him notice the way sunlight caught in Livia's dark hair, the way her rare smiles transformed her serious face, the way she moved through the world with quiet confidence that he was only beginning to understand was its own form of strength. He had been drawn to her in a way that terrified him, because it meant acknowledging how profoundly wrong he had been about her, about omegas, about what made someone valuable. It meant confronting the ugliness of his own prejudices and the poison his father's teachings had planted in his heart. One evening, 3 months after the twins' near drowning, Gaius had found Livia sitting alone on a hillside overlooking the settlement. The sun had been setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and she had been so still she might have been part of the landscape itself. He had approached carefully, giving her plenty of opportunity to hear him coming, and had stopped a respectful distance away. "May I sit?" She had glanced at him, then nodded toward the ground beside her. They had sat in silence for a while, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. Finally, Gaius had found the courage to speak. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done, for saving them, for coming back, for giving me another chance." "You thank me by being better," Livia had said simply. "By continuing to change, even when it's hard." "It is hard," he had admitted. "Every day, I catch myself falling back into old patterns, wanting to assert dominance instead of building consensus, seeing disagreement as challenge instead of collaboration." "But you catch yourself," Livia had pointed out. "That's what matters. Change isn't a destination, Gaius. It's a practice." He had turned to look at her then, this small woman who had somehow become the most important person in his pack, and had felt the words rising in his throat before he could stop them. "I was taught that omegas were weak, that they needed protection, that they were lesser somehow." "I know," Livia had said quietly. "Most alphas were taught that." "You're the strongest person I know," Gaius had continued. "Not despite being an omega but because of it. You carry knowledge that would crush most people. You feel everything so deeply. And you still choose kindness, even toward those who've hurt you." Livia had been quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had been careful. "Where is this coming from, Gaius?" He had taken a deep breath. "I think I've been falling in love with you since the moment you saved my children. Maybe since before that, since the moment you told me I was wrong and I was too stubborn to hear it. And I needed you to know, even though I have no right to your affection, even though I've done nothing to earn it." She had turned to face him fully then, her storm-gray eyes searching his face. "Love isn't something you earn, Gaius. Something you nurture. And yes, you've done terrible things, made terrible mistakes. But you're also trying to grow from them. That matters." "Does it matter enough?" he had asked, hardly daring to hope. Livia had smiled, small and sad and somehow hopeful all at once. "Ask me again in a year. After you've proven that this change is real, that it lasts. After I've seen you lead with wisdom instead of just strength. Then maybe we'll see what grows between us." It had been both a rejection and a promise, and Gaius had accepted it with more grace than he had possessed 6 months earlier. "A year, then. I'll ask you again in a year." Now, 10 months later, Gaius stood at the edge of that same hillside, watching the same sunset, and knew that he had become someone worthy of asking that question again. The pack had flourished under his changed leadership. Alliances with neighboring packs had strengthened. The young wolves looked at him with respect instead of fear. And Livia had become beloved by everyone, not as a curiosity or a tool, but as a cherished member of the pack whose wisdom guided them all. He had learned to read the signs himself, taught by Livia's patient instruction. He could see patterns in bird flight, warning in the wind, danger in the too quiet moments. He would never have her gift, but he had learned to value and cultivate his own intuition, to balance his warrior's instincts with deeper wisdom. The prophecy about Blackwood Pack had been proven correct within weeks of Livia's return. Their alpha had indeed been trying to provoke Silverpine into attacking first, and when Gaius had instead sent emissaries to discuss the territorial dispute peacefully, Blackwood's schemes had been exposed. The other packs had seen Silverpine's wisdom and had strengthened their alliances accordingly. Gaius's father would have called it weakness. Gaius now understood it as strength. He heard footsteps behind him and knew without turning that it was Livia. She had a way of moving that was uniquely hers, quiet but not secretive, present but not imposing. She sat beside him without asking, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. They had become comfortable with each other over these months, falling into an easy partnership that felt both natural and precious. It's been almost a year, she said softly. I know, Gaius replied. I've been counting the days. Have you? Every single one. He turned to face her, his heart suddenly pounding. You told me to ask again after a year. After I'd proven the change was real. Livia's expression was gentle, her eyes reflecting the sunset's glow. I did say that. The year is almost up, Gaius continued. And I think I've become someone different than I was. Not perfect, still learning, but genuinely changed. So I'm asking now before the year is actually complete, because I can't wait any longer. He took her hand, feeling how small it was in his, how delicate, and knowing that delicacy was not the same as fragility. Livia, would you consent to be my mate? Not because I'm Alpha and you're Omega, not because of any hierarchical obligation, but because I love you and I cannot imagine leading this pack, living this life, without you beside me. Tears had gathered in Livia's eyes, but she was smiling. You're asking me 2 weeks early, you know. The year isn't quite up. I know, Gaius said. But I also know that life is fragile, that we can lose everything in a moment, and I don't want to waste any more time than I already have. Livia laughed, the sound like water over stones, bright and clear. You've learned well. She squeezed his hand. Yes, Gaius. Yes, I'll be your mate. Not because you're Alpha, and not even because you've changed, though you have. But because I've been falling in love with you too, watching you become someone who deserves the title he carries. Gaius had pulled her close then, careful and reverent, and had kissed her as the sun completed its descent and the stars began to emerge. It had felt like a beginning and a healing all at once, like something broken finally being made whole. The pack had celebrated their mating with joy that Gaius had never seen before. His people had learned to love Livia, to value her, and they saw this union as right in a way that transcended politics or tradition. An Alpha and an Omega, strength and wisdom, finally balanced as they should have been all along. Marcus and Aurelia had been ecstatic, having long ago decided that Livia should be their mother. The formal ceremony had made it official, and they had clung to her afterward, their small arms wrapped around her waist, their faces glowing with happiness. In the years that followed, Silver Pine Pack had become known throughout the region as a place of balance, where warriors trained alongside healers, where scouts learned from elders, where every member was valued for their unique gifts. Other packs had begun to seek out their own Omegas, had begun to understand that the old ways of hierarchy and dominance had weakened them rather than strengthened them. Gaius had led hunts and defended borders, but he had also learned to sit in council and listen more than he spoke. He had learned to ask Livia's opinion before making major decisions, not because he couldn't make them himself, but because her perspective made his choices wiser. He had learned that true strength lay not in never needing help, but in knowing when to seek it. Livia had taught the young ones, not just about herbs and healing, but about reading the world's subtle languages. She had trained several of them in the old Omega arts, those gifts of foresight and intuition that had nearly been lost. The pack had grown richer for it, more resilient, more connected to the natural world they lived in. And late at night, when the pack was settled and the twins were asleep, Gaius would lie beside Livia and marvel at how close he had come to losing everything. How his pride had nearly cost him his children. How his prejudice had nearly driven away the one person who would complete him. What are you thinking? Livia would ask, feeling his wakefulness beside her. That I was a fool, he would always answer honestly. Yes, she would agree, but gently. But you were a fool who learned better. That's the important part. Sometimes Gaius would dream about that day at the river, would relive those terrible moments when Marcus and Aurelia had lain blue and still on the bank. In the dreams, Livia never came. In the dreams, his children died, and he was left to face a lifetime of knowing his pride had killed them. He would wake gasping from these nightmares, and Livia would hold him, would remind him that it hadn't happened that way, that they were all safe, that mistakes could be learned from if you survived them. The gods gave us a second chance, she would whisper. Don't waste it on guilt. Use it to be better. And he would try. Every day he would try. The twins grew strong and wise, raised by an Alpha father who had learned humility and an Omega mother who taught them to value strength in all its forms. Marcus became a warrior, but one who thought before fighting, who sought diplomatic solutions before violent ones. Aurelia became a healer and seer, her gifts as strong as Livia's, her wisdom growing with each passing year. The pack prospered. Neighboring territories sought alliance rather than conflict. The forest provided bountifully because the pack had learned to read its rhythms, to take only what was needed, to honor the balance between predator and prey. And through it all, Gaius remembered what he had almost lost. He remembered the moment when his children had disappeared beneath the water, when he had realized that the only person who could save them was gone because of his own arrogance. That memory stayed with him, not as a wound but as a reminder, a touchstone that kept him honest when his old pride tried to resurface. He had learned that leadership wasn't about being right all the time. It was about being willing to be wrong and learning from it. It was about surrounding yourself with people who saw what you couldn't see, who possessed gifts you didn't possess, and honoring those gifts instead of fearing them. Years passed, and the story of the Alpha who had banished his Omega and nearly lost everything became a cautionary tale told in packs across the region. Young Alphas would hear it and understand that true strength required wisdom, that pride was the most dangerous enemy a leader could face. But for Gaius, it was never just a story. It was his life, his failure, his redemption. It was the moment that had broken him open and allowed something better to grow in the cracks. On the 10th anniversary of that terrible day at the river, Gaius stood once again on the bank where his children had nearly died. Livia stood beside him, her hand in his, her presence a comfort and a reminder. Marcus and Aurelia, now 15, stood nearby with the pack, all of them gathered for a ceremony Gaius had designed to honor not just survival, but transformation. 10 years ago, Gaius began, his voice carrying across the assembled wolves. I failed you all. I let my pride blind me to wisdom. I banished the one person whose gifts could have prevented tragedy. And when that tragedy came, when my children slipped beneath this water, I understood in the most painful way possible that I had been leading you all wrong. The pack listened in respectful silence. They knew this story, but hearing it from their Alpha's own mouth, hearing him claim his failure publicly, still carried power. Livia saved my children that day, Gaius continued. But she saved me too. She saved us all by showing us that strength comes in many forms, that wisdom is not weakness, that the old ways of rigid hierarchy were killing us slowly even before they nearly killed Marcus and Aurelia quickly. He turned to face Livia, taking both her hands in his. You gave me a second chance I didn't deserve. You stayed when you should have run. You taught me when you should have let me fail. And you loved me despite everything I had done to hurt you. Tears streamed down Livia's face, but she was smiling. You earned that second chance, Gaius. Every day you earned it. I'm still earning it, he said. I'll spend the rest of my life earning it. He turned back to the pack. Today we remember what we almost lost and celebrate what we gained. We honor not just the survival of 2 children, but the rebirth of our pack into something stronger, wiser, and more balanced than it was before. The ceremony that followed was beautiful and solemn. They placed stones in the river, each one representing a lesson learned, a change made, a gift now valued that had once been dismissed. They sang the old songs that honored Omegas, songs that had been forgotten during Gaius's father's rule and his own foolish continuation of those prejudices. And as the sun set over the river, turning the water to liquid gold, Gaius felt a peace he had never known in his youth. The peace of knowing your mistakes and choosing to grow from them. The peace of being surrounded by people you had learned to truly value. The peace of a love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. That night, as the pack celebrated around bonfires, Marcus approached his father. The boy had grown tall and strong, his features a perfect blend of his mother's delicate beauty and his father's powerful presence. But his eyes held something neither parent had possessed at his age. Wisdom born from surviving trauma and being raised by people who had learned from their mistakes. Father, Marcus said quietly, I want to thank you. Gaius looked at his son in surprise. Thank me. For what? For being willing to change. Marcus replied. For showing me that admitting you're wrong isn't weakness. That learning from mistakes is the bravest thing a leader can do. He glanced toward Livia, who was teaching a group of young ones a complex herbal remedy. And for recognizing that mother is your equal, not your subordinate. You've given me a model of partnership that I'll carry into my own leadership someday. Gaius felt his throat tighten with emotion. You'll be a better Alpha than I was at your age. You already are. Only because I learned from your mistakes and your corrections, Marcus said. That's the gift, Father. Not that you never failed, but that you showed us how to rise from failure. After Marcus walked away, Aurelia came to sit beside her father. She had her mother's gift of foresight, and lately, she had been having visions that troubled her. Gaius could see the concern in her eyes. What do you see, little star? He asked, using the pet name he'd given her as a baby. Change is coming, Aurelia said softly. Big ones. Not bad necessarily, but significant. The world is shifting, Father. The old ways are dying everywhere, not just here. Other packs are struggling with the same questions we struggled with. Some will adapt like we did. Others will cling to the old ways and suffer for it, Gaius finished. Yes, Aurelia confirmed. And they'll look to us. To you and Mother. To the example you've set. The story of what happened here is spreading, and it's giving hope to Omegas in other packs, challenging Alphas who think strength means dominance. Gaius considered this. That's a heavy responsibility. You've been preparing for it, Aurelia said. Whether you knew it or not, every choice you've made since that day at the river has been preparing us all for this. We're not just a pack anymore, Father. We're a model. A proof that change is possible. She was right, and Gaius felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. But it was a weight he could bear now, tempered by wisdom and supported by partnership. He wasn't carrying it alone. The following months brought exactly what Aurelia had foreseen. Delegations from other packs began arriving, some openly seeking advice, others ostensibly visiting for diplomatic reasons but clearly observing how Silverpine functioned. Alphas who had heard the story of Gaius's failure and redemption came wanting to understand how to implement similar changes in their own packs. Gaius and Livia welcomed them all, sharing their story honestly, including the painful parts. They didn't present themselves as perfect leaders who had all the answers. Instead, they shared their journey. The mistakes, the near tragedy, the slow work of rebuilding trust and restructuring power. Some visiting Alphas embraced the message. Others rejected it, too proud or too fearful to admit their own packs might benefit from change. Gaius recognized his younger self in those Alphas and felt compassion rather than judgment. He knew how hard it was to see past your own conditioning, your own father's voice in your head telling you that dominance was the only language power understood. One particular visit stood out. An Alpha named Septimus came from a pack 3 territories away, a massive man with scars across his face and arms that spoke of countless battles. His pack was known for their warriors, their aggression, their isolation from other packs. Septimus sat across from Gaius in the council chamber, his eyes hard and skeptical. I've heard the story, he said bluntly, about how you nearly lost your children because you sent away your Omega, about how you changed your whole pack structure because of it. That's accurate, Gaius confirmed. And you expect me to believe that making your pack soft made it stronger? Septimus's tone was challenging. Gaius smiled, recognizing the test. I don't expect you to believe anything. I'm simply sharing what happened and what we learned from it. Whether you find value in that is your choice. My father taught me that Alphas lead through strength, Septimus said. That the pack follows the strongest wolf, and any challenge to that strength must be crushed immediately. My father taught me the same thing, Gaius replied. And I followed that teaching until it nearly destroyed everything I loved. Septimus leaned forward. But you're still Alpha. You didn't abdicate. You didn't let your Omega take over. Of course not, Gaius said. Because being Alpha isn't about being the only voice. It's about being the one who synthesizes all voices and makes the final decision. Livia doesn't want my position, and I don't want to give it up. What changed is that I now seek her counsel and value her wisdom. I lead, but I don't lead alone. That sounds like weakness wearing a mask, Septimus challenged. Livia, who had been sitting quietly in the corner as was her custom during formal meetings, spoke up then. May I ask you a question, Septimus? The visiting Alpha turned to look at her, his expression carefully neutral. Of course. When was the last time someone in your pack told you that you were wrong about something important? Livia asked gently. Septimus was silent for a long moment. Alphas aren't wrong about important things. Everyone is wrong sometimes, Livia said. The question is whether the people around you feel safe telling you when you are. If they don't, then you're making decisions based on incomplete information, surrounded by yes-wolves who are too afraid to correct your mistakes. Gaius watched Septimus's face and saw the moment the words landed, saw the flicker of recognition. This was an Alpha who had probably been making unchallenged decisions for years, who had surrounded himself with people too intimidated to offer contrary opinions. I have advisors, Septimus said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. Do you have people who disagree with you? Livia pressed. Who challenge your assumptions? Who bring you information you don't want to hear? Septimus looked away, his jaw tight. I have my ways of gathering information. I'm sure you do, Livia said gently. But information isn't the same as wisdom. Facts aren't the same as foresight. You can know everything about a situation and still miss the pattern, still miss what it means. And you see patterns? Septimus asked, his tone somewhere between skeptical and curious. Sometimes, Livia admitted. Not always. But I see enough that Gaius knows to listen when I warn him about something. And he's strong enough in himself that listening to me doesn't threaten his authority. Septimus turned back to Gaius. How do you know when to listen to her and when to trust your own judgment? I always listen to her, Gaius said simply. That doesn't mean I always do what she suggests, but I always consider it seriously. And over time, I've learned to recognize when she's sensing something I can't see, when her gifts are picking up on dangers or opportunities that aren't obvious to me. What if you're wrong? Septimus asked. What if you listen to her and it leads to disaster? Then it leads to disaster, Gaius said with a shrug. I'll deal with the consequences and learn from it. But I can tell you from painful experience that ignoring wisdom because you're afraid of looking weak is far more likely to lead to disaster than honestly considering it. Septimus sat back, his expression thoughtful. They talked for another hour, and Gaius watched the visiting Alpha slowly soften, slowly open to possibilities he had previously dismissed. It reminded him of his own journey, of how hard it had been to let go of his father's teachings and embrace something new. Before Septimus left, he asked to speak with Livia privately. Gaius allowed it, trusting both of them, and later Livia told him that Septimus had admitted his pack had lost 3 children in the past year to accidents that might have been prevented. That he was haunted by it but didn't know how to change course without seeming weak to his warriors. I told him that seeming weak and being weak were different things, Livia said. That admitting you need help is actually one of the strongest things a leader can do. I don't know if he'll change, but I think the seed is planted. 6 months later, they received word that Septimus had invited an Omega into his pack council and had formally apologized for years of dismissing her gifts. It was a small change, but it was a beginning. As the years continued to pass, the ripples from Silverpine's transformation spread wider. A network of packs began forming, connected by a shared commitment to balanced leadership, to valuing all gifts, to honoring both strength and wisdom. They called themselves the New Alliance, and Gaius and Livia became unofficial leaders of the movement, not through force but through example. Marcus grew into a formidable young man, respected by warriors and healers alike. He had inherited his father's strength and his mother's intuition, and at 20, he was already being discussed as the future Alpha of Silverpine. But he showed no impatience to claim the title, content to learn and grow under his parents' guidance. Aurelia's gifts of foresight had grown stronger, and she had become sought after by other packs for her counsel. She was gentle like her mother but possessed a core of steel that came from knowing she had died and been brought back, from understanding how fragile life was and how precious each moment could be. On the 20th anniversary of the twins' near drowning, the pack gathered again at the river. But this time they were joined by members of a dozen other packs, all coming to participate in what had become an annual ceremony of remembrance and renewal. Gaius stood before the assembled wolves, now in his late 40s. His dark hair threaded with silver, his face lined by years of responsibility and growth. Livia stood beside him, still small and still powerful, her presence a calm center in any storm. 20 years ago, Gaius began, and his voice still carried the weight of that old grief. I made the worst mistake of my life. I let pride and prejudice blind me to wisdom and value. I sent away the one person who could have protected my children, and when disaster came, I stood helpless as they slipped beneath these waters. He paused, letting the words settle over the crowd. I tell this story not to flagellate myself with guilt, but to remind us all how easy it is to destroy what we love through our own arrogance. How quickly our certainty can become our downfall. How desperately we need people in our lives who see what we cannot see. Marcus and Aurelia came to stand with their parents, both of them now adults, both of them living testaments to the power of second chances. My children survived, Gaius continued, because Livia came back. Because she loved them enough to run through the forest until her feet bled. Because she possessed knowledge I had dismissed as worthless. Because she valued life more than she resented me. He turned to Livia, taking her hand. And in saving them, she saved me. She gave me the chance to become someone worthy of the title I carried. She taught me that true leadership requires humility, that strength is nothing without wisdom to guide it, that power without compassion is just tyranny. Livia squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with tears as they always were when he spoke of that day. To all of you gathered here, Gaius said, addressing the crowd, I offer this: examine your own prejudices. Question your own certainties. Look for the voices you've been ignoring and ask yourself why. Who in your pack has gifts you've dismissed? What wisdom have you rejected because it came from someone you considered weak? He paused, scanning the faces before him. The old ways are dying, and that's good. They needed to die. But we need to build something better in their place, something that honors all the gifts our people possess, not just the obvious ones. We need to create packs where omegas are valued, where healers have the same respect as warriors, where anyone can speak truth to power without fear. The crowd erupted in howls of agreement, the sound echoing across the valley. It was a sound of change, of commitment, of wolves choosing to be better than their ancestors had been. After the ceremony, as the various packs mingled and shared meals, Gaius found himself alone with Livia on the hillside where he had first confessed his love to her. The same hillside where they had watched sunsets together, where they had built a partnership that had become the foundation of everything good in his life. Do you ever regret it? He asked quietly. Coming back that day. Giving me another chance when you should have let me face the consequences of my actions. Livia considered the question seriously, as she always did. Sometimes I regret the pain of it. The fear I felt running through that forest, knowing I might be too late. The anger I felt at you for putting your children in danger through your stubbornness. She turned to face him. But I don't regret the outcome. Look at what grew from that terrible day. Look at the lives that have changed, the packs that have transformed, the omegas who now live with dignity and respect. All because my children nearly died, Gaius said, the old guilt rising. No, Livia corrected gently. All because you learned from it. The tragedy was the catalyst, but your choice to change was what mattered. Plenty of alphas face disasters and learn nothing, blame everyone but themselves, double down on their worst traits. You didn't do that. You broke open and let something better grow in the cracks. Gaius pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of herbs and pine that always clung to her. I love you, he said simply. I loved you when I was too stupid to know it, and I love you now that I'm wise enough to appreciate it. I love you too, Livia murmured against his chest. My stubborn, reformed, constantly improving Alpha. They stood there as the sun set, watching their pack and the visiting packs mingle below, watching their children laugh with young wolves from other territories, watching the future unfold in real time. And Gaius felt grateful in a way that went deeper than words, grateful for second chances and hard lessons and the woman who had saved him from himself. In the years that followed, the new alliance grew stronger. More packs joined, drawn by the promise of balanced leadership and valued diversity. There were still traditional packs that rejected these changes, still alphas who clung to the old ways of dominance and hierarchy. But slowly, inexorably, the tide was turning. Gaius and Livia trained other alphas and omegas in partnership models, teaching them how to share power without undermining authority, how to value different gifts without creating resentment. They helped establish schools where young wolves could learn both warrior skills and healing arts, where intuition was honored alongside strength. Marcus eventually became Alpha of Silverpine when Gaius stepped down at 60, but the transition was smooth because Marcus had been prepared his entire life for collaborative leadership. He chose a young Omega named Julia as his primary advisor, and together they continued building on the foundation his parents had established. Aurelia never became an Alpha, but her influence spread far beyond any single pack. She traveled between territories, offering her gifts of foresight and healing, teaching young Omegas to trust their intuition, helping packs navigate challenges that couldn't be solved through physical strength alone. Gaius and Livia spent their later years as elders, respected and sought after for their wisdom. They told their story to countless young wolves, never hiding the ugly parts, never pretending Gaius had always been enlightened. They believed that the truth of failure and redemption was more valuable than any myth of perfect leadership. On the 40th anniversary of the twins' near drowning, Gaius was 70 and Livia 68. They moved more slowly now, their bodies marked by age, but their minds remained sharp and their bond as strong as ever. They walked to the river one last time, alone now, no ceremony planned, just the two of them and the memories that lived in this place. "Do you remember," Gaius said softly, "when you told me to ask you again in a year? When you said you needed to see if my change was real?" "I remember," Livia said, smiling. "Did you know even then that you would say yes?" "No," Livia admitted. "I genuinely didn't know. You could have reverted. Most do, actually. Real change is rare and hard. But you surprised me, Gaius. You kept surprising me for 40 years. I had good motivation," he said. "I never wanted to feel the way I felt that day, standing on this bank, watching my children die because of my pride. That terror, that despair, that understanding that I had destroyed everything I loved through my own stupidity. I never wanted to feel that again." "You turned trauma into growth," Livia said. "That's the rarest gift of all." They stood in silence for a while, holding hands, watching the water flow past. The same water that had nearly taken Marcus and Aurelia, the same river that had become a symbol of both tragedy and transformation. "I'm tired," Gaius admitted finally. "I'm ready to rest." "I know," Livia said, and there was no sadness in her voice, only understanding. "So am I." They had lived full lives, long lives, good lives earned through hard work and constant growth. They had seen their children flourish and their grandchildren begin their own journeys. They had changed the world around them in ways large and small. That night, lying in their bed with moonlight streaming through the window, Gaius felt a peace that was absolute. He had no regrets, or at least none that he hadn't worked to atone for. He had been a terrible alpha once and had become a good one. He had been blind and had learned to see. He had been cruel and had learned kindness. "Thank you," he whispered to Livia, who lay curled against him, her breathing already soft with approaching sleep. "Thank you for coming back that day. Thank you for every day since. Thank you for being worth coming back to," she murmured. They fell asleep in each other's arms, and when Marcus found them the next morning, they had passed together, peacefully, their hands still clasped. The pack mourned, but it was a mourning mixed with celebration. They had lost their elders, but those elders had lived fully and died content. They had left behind a legacy that would endure for generations, a model of leadership that had spread far beyond Silverpine's borders. At the funeral, Marcus stood before the assembled pack and told his parents' story one more time. He spoke of his father's failure and redemption, his mother's wisdom and forgiveness. He spoke of the day he and Aurelia had nearly drowned and how that moment had changed everything. "They taught us," Marcus said, his voice strong despite his grief, "that mistakes don't have to define us, that we can grow from our worst moments, that strength and wisdom together are more powerful than either alone, that love requires humility, and leadership requires listening, and change requires courage." He paused, looking out at the crowd that included wolves from dozens of packs, all of them touched by his parents' lives. "My father used to say that he spent his life earning the second chance my mother gave him. But the truth is, we all need second chances. We all make mistakes. The question is whether we learn from them or repeat them. Whether we let pride keep us blind or let humility help us see." The pack howled their agreement, and the sound carried across the valley, a tribute to two wolves who had transformed not just themselves but the world around them. Years later, the story of Gaius and Livia was still told around pack fires, passed down to pups who hadn't known them personally but understood the lesson they represented. The Alpha who had nearly lost everything because he valued dominance over wisdom. The Omega who had saved not just children but an entire way of life. The partnership that had proved strength and intuition could work together instead of competing. And at the river where it all began, where Marcus and Aurelia had slipped beneath the water and been pulled back from death, young wolves continued to place stones in remembrance. Not just remembering tragedy but celebrating transformation. Not just mourning what was almost lost, but honoring what was found. The water flowed on, constant and changing, carrying the past into the future, washing away old ways and nourishing new growth. And in that flow was the lesson that Gaius had learned at such terrible cost. That nothing stays the same, that trying to hold too tightly to certainty will destroy you, that the willingness to change is the greatest strength a leader can possess. The twins had slipped beneath the water, but they had been pulled back. Gaius had fallen into the darkness of his own pride, but he had climbed out. The old ways had died, but something better had been born. And in that cycle of death and rebirth, of failure and redemption, of falling and rising, was the story of what it meant to be truly strong. Not invincible, not infallible, not dominant, just strong enough to admit weakness, wise enough to seek help, humble enough to change, and brave enough to love despite having every reason not to. That was the legacy of the Alpha who banished the only Omega who protected them, and then spent the rest of his life making amends for it. It was a legacy written in water and stone, in tears and triumphs, in the lives of everyone who heard the story and chose to be better than they had been. And it all began with a terrible moment when two small children disappeared beneath dark water, and an Alpha realized that the only person who could save them was gone because he had sent her away. That moment of devastation had become a moment of transformation. That failure had become a foundation for something better. And that, in the end, was the most powerful lesson of all.